Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of Star Wars Connection. My name is Michelle and I'll be your host for today's episode. Today we're going to talk about one of the big plot twists that came out of The Last Jedi. Kylo Ren killing Supreme Leader Snoke and taking on the title of Supreme Leader himself. In the Star Wars fandom, we've typically referred to this act as Kylo Ren becoming Renperor. For this podcast, we'll be using a slightly different format than most of our episodes, using a throwdown-style debate format, as we'll be diving into one of the big questions that fans have been debating about the ending of The Last Jedi. Now that he's Supreme Leader, what sort of ruler will Kylo Ren be when we see him again in Episode 9? Will he be a Renperor, an immediate continuation of the person we saw in the final battle on Crate, where he's hot-headed, impulsive, and frankly a bit of a hot mess? Or will we see a Benperor? Given the last shot of Ben Solo looking penitent, is there a chance that he might have learned from his mistakes and actually proved to be a competent and perhaps even benevolent leader? So arguing for this side of Renperor, we have Tina and Willow today.
Hey guys!
On Team Renperor today, we have Felix and Irina.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi!
Okay, first question. Let's start off by talking about how we see Kylo Ren as a ruler. Team Renperor, why don't you go first? Tina, what do you think?
Alright, so given the utter failure of the Battle of Crate and the sole reason why it happened the way it did, I see Renperor lasting about 10 minutes. Okay, so maybe that's an exaggeration, but still, most leaders, anyways the successful ones that I know of, have come into power either due to years of planning or plotting, you pick, or have studied it for their entire lives, moving up the ladder as in their political circles. So for these competent leaders, the answer is never, he did it because of a girl. And let's face it, the entire Crate sequence happened because he was jilted by Rey. Hux may not know the full details of what went down in the throne room, but he knows that something is amiss. The way Hux is looking at Ben in that final shot where he's kneeling on the ground with the dice in his hand tells me that a coup is coming, probably sooner rather than later. I also think that given the nature of Star Wars, you have to ask yourself which is going to be the more of an action-packed adventure. So I think a short-lived Renperor is going to have more potential for that, as opposed to him just growing into the role, especially if Rey ends up coming to his rescue at some point.
Sounds good. Willow, what do you think?
Well, I don't think Kylo's much of a leader at heart. I mean, he's kind of a simple guy who's really just fueled by emotion, and very human emotion. Pain, anger, grief, love, etc. He feels the desperate need to be more than he is, to be more than his father or his grandfather, but deep down, believing you should do something as a result of entitlement and genuinely wanting that thing are very different. So as a leader, I tend to think Kylo would just be overwhelmed, miserable, and angrier than ever, because he found what he really wanted in The Last Jedi, but he was unable to let go of what he thought he needed. That's kind of the irony in his proposal to Rey in the throne room. He screams that she needs to move on from her past, but he's the only one being ruled by it. To add to that, one of my biggest problems with Benperor right now is I just can't see Kylo being in any frame of mind to make intelligent decisions. He's probably going to be way too distracted.
Those are some great opening arguments. Team Benperor, how do you see Kylo Ren as a ruler? Felix, what do you think?
Well, admittedly, Kylo doesn't exactly have the greatest track record with impulse control thus far, but that's part of his growth process, and 9 is the third installment in the story where we expect to see tremendous change and growth. We have to keep in mind that while he's definitely strong in the temperamental Skywalker and Solo Y genes, he's also Princess Leia's son and Queen Amidala's grandson, and these are two women who have strong leadership skills. We've already seen the possibility for Ben to show tremendous self-control when necessary, when he waits for the opportune moment to kill Snoke while quietly seething because Snoke has just tortured Rey. So for me, satisfying character growth would involve him consciously honing in on that side of his genetics, the ability to plan and apply that plan to his ideals at the right moment, like Leia and Padme are able to. I also see Ben Solo as the kind of guy who's really idealistic at heart, even if that idealism gets twisted into a Kylo-esque version. Ben has a distinct sense of morality that we've heard in his statement that Han Solo would have disappointed Rey, and we've seen this in his version of what happened with Luke. I think as a supreme leader who's been searching for father figures his whole life and finally decided to cut his losses, so to speak, Ben could come to see himself as a father figure to the galaxy, and that would translate into the kinds of projects he'd delve into. Like, I can see him being particularly affected by what he knows of Rey's life and delving into humanitarian projects, but maybe in a kind of twisted authoritarian kind of way. I see him as the type to remove people like Unkar Plutt through aggressive negotiations and then institute a livable galactic minimum wage, that sort of thing. I also see him developing the ability to be charismatic in the same way his mother is. But for Kylo, maybe that could translate into more of a cult of personality. You know, kind of like how Vladimir Putin puts out pictures of himself riding shirtless on a horse and his supporters eat it up. Kylo would totally ride shirtless on a faldier. So essentially, I think I see Benperor as the kind of leader whose tactics you don't necessarily agree with, but you kind of can't help but admire how much he's actually able to get accomplished.
Sounds good. Irina, what do you think?
Okay, so we also need to keep in mind that Snoke isn't around anymore, and I know we're going to talk about it later, but I think it's important to mention it here. So they didn't have him die in Dark Middle chapter for nothing. So the point is that we're going to see how Ben is without his influence. So Last Jedi really had Han's ghost hovering around, even if he was never physically around, like a Force ghost, for instance. But we really saw him hovering around through Ben. So as Amber Rue once said, he has too much of his father in him. So he has Han's heart, which means that when it comes to the people he cares about, he'd do anything for them. So I think that since Episode 9 was meant to be Leia's movie, we'd really get to see the Leia in him. So we already got hints of that in Last Jedi, but I'm convinced he inherited her mind of steel. Leia says as much in the Aftermath books. So where I want to get at is that Ben is not a bad seed, of course, and he managed to resist Snoke for years. Like, he even managed to clever enough to trick Snoke at his own game and make him believe that he was going to kill someone, but that someone was him and not Rey. So I definitely think he'll be more interested in building than conquest. You know, unlike Hux, who is Ben's evil foil of sorts, because I think that's what he had in mind when he proposed to Rey. You know, he's a messed up, idealistic little boy. As for how authoritarian he'll be, honestly, I don't know. I don't see him being particularly kind to people like Plutt. You know, not that Plutt doesn't deserve it, and I mean, Chewie ripped off his arm. Who cares what happens to Plutt? So, I do believe that Hux will be a big obstacle for him, and Hux will probably have a good chunk of the officers in his pockets. But, you know, this said, we do know some of the officers are not happy with Hux. Let's keep that in mind. And, you know, the people financing the First Order, the shitty rich people we saw in Canto Bight, and, you know, they sell arms. So, you know, no war, no sales. So big financiers are obviously not very happy. So I think it's definitely going to slow him down what he wants to accomplish. And it's going to be a reminder to him of all those times, you know, his mother would probably complain about how the New Republic said it never got anything done. And we know that pretty much thanks to Bloodline. And, you know, it's also a callback to Padme in The Phantom Menace trying to get the Republic to save Naboo from the Trade Federation.
Sounds great. Moving on to question number 2, let's talk about the setup for how we either get a Renperor or a Benperor. When we left Kylo at the end of The Last Jedi, he had just had the most epic jilted lover meltdown ever, going absolutely ballistic on Crate and showing a complete lack of tactical judgment. His tantrum led to the Resistance being able to escape. However, in the last scene involving the First Order on Crate, Kylo's on his knees looking completely broken, while Hux is looking on in the background looking like he'll murder Kylo in the first chance he gets. So there's a fair amount of ambiguity with Kylo's setup for Episode 9. How do we think that the end of The Last Jedi sets us up for a Benperor or a Renperor scenario? Team Benperor, you go first this time. Irina, what do you think?
Well, first off, I don't think he'll go worse from here. I mean, his worst crime was still to kill his father, and when it comes to behavior, well, we saw the worst of him. Like, he was throwing the tantrum of a century at the end of The Last Jedi. But, you know, he's really had a point where he got everything he wanted. But, you know, he really realizes at that moment how pointless it is without Rey, and he can't have both. He can't have both the power and Rey, and deep down he knows it. So I think he'll stick to being Benperor, not so much because he thinks he can find some comfort in power, because I think he's realized by the end of The Last Jedi that he won't. And sure, he's emotional, but he's also pragmatic. So if he leaves, you have Hux taking over, and I think we can all agree Ben is a lesser evil than Hux. So he can also probably come to the conclusion that, hey, it won't be fun, but at least he can still try and do something good for once in his life, right? So, you know, it might also stem from spite. I think on one hand, we'll have Rey, who will try her very best to integrate herself into the Resistance with varying degrees of success. And on the other hand, we'll have Ben, who will go and try to be a good leader, partly in an attempt to tell Rey, see, I'm not messing it up like you thought I would. And I speak from experience that when you spend your life being constantly demeaned and belittled, you'll do anything to prove to people who underestimate you wrong. Again, he will be disillusioned for the reasons I've mentioned before, and Hux will try to backstab him, but that doesn't mean necessarily that all his efforts will be fruitless to an extent. Like, he has a tendency to think with his you-know-what whenever there's a girl around, but, considering all the men in his family, that's hardly surprising. But I'm convinced he's not stupid at all. He's deeply intelligent, and not just in a book smart way.
I do think the spike could definitely play into it. Like, I kind of see Kylo as being, the ex-boyfriend who gets dumped by his girlfriend, and he wants to show off by hitting the gym and getting a new job and everything. Look, see what you could have had. So I think that's a really good argument to bring up. Felix, what do you think? How do you think that the end of 9 sets us up for a Benperor scenario?
Yeah, well, the thing about the end of The Last Jedi is, kind of like Irina was saying, we already saw Kylo at his absolute worst. He has his jilted lover meltdown of Skywalker proportions, swearing to destroy her and you and all of it. But we see how that turns out when he ends up on his knees, crying because he realizes he lost the chance at being a pair with Rey. And I don't see him having anywhere else to go but up. And where The Last Jedi leaves him is at the bottom of the pit of despair. Since he's already hit bottom, I think that provides the perfect setup for him to wallow in his misery in more of this withdrawn depression before determining to be the best little Benperor who could. Hux is already plotting his assassination, and we saw that, but I don't see Hux being able to pull that rabbit out of the hat, considering Ben is powerful in the Force, and we've already seen him sense his uncle considering killing him. Plus, we've seen Hux be a cold, calculating type who waits for the opportune moment for vengeance and then savors it when he catches Ben. So in the Benperor scenario, I think it's likely while Kylo is coming out of his funk, Hux will be plotting. And then when Kylo becomes more of a Benperor and starts putting heavy-handed restrictions on how and when and under what circumstances Hux, who, don't forget, is a total megalomaniac, can utilize his military, that'll be the final straw for Hux. A galaxy who actually likes their benevolent Renperor, which, if he's forcibly instituting social programs the New Republic never could get to stick in the Outer Rim, and we did hear a little bit about that in Bloodline. That would win major underdog support from the general population for the Benperor. That republic would also naturally be told the resistance is a bunch of terrorists. In fact, we've seen that sort of imagery suggested of the rebellion in Rogue One with the jihadist garb. But anyway, I think that would provide the setup for Hux to out Ren as a traitor, because someone is going to realize that the Jedi Killer and the Last Jedi are having a torrid Skype affair, because they're going to end up back at it again. And I see Hux being the type to out Supreme Leader Ren to the galaxy as cavorting with the enemy in an effort to get him overthrown.
Ooh. And that definitely fits with Hux. I mean, we know from the Phasma novel that Hux conspired with Phasma to kill his own father, and he waited for the opportune time to do that.
Absolutely.
So, moving on to Team Renperor, how do you think the ending of The Last Jedi sets us up for a Renperor in Episode 9? Willow, what do you think?
Well, in storytelling, I find that you often have to reiterate past points in new installments, so I don't really think that Kylo kneeling in front of Rey and looking very repentant means anything more than a representation of how miserable he is without her. It's just a reminder that they have this connection. I don't necessarily think it means that he's learned his lesson, or that that moment of realization has necessarily come. I mean, he got everything he wanted, right? Or did he? That's kind of the core of the scene for me. I think Kylo's character is all about his desire to separate himself from the past. I want to witness every painful step of Kylo accepting that he was wrong, and the less wrong he is, the less believable it might be for me. That's not to say I think he's going to get way worse. He definitely won't, and I don't really think he can. But I do see him attempting to prove to himself that he made the right decision, despite knowing deep down that he didn't, because he lost the only thing that really mattered. He won't be able to accept that, and maybe it'll make him angry or more depressed or more determined to do what he has to do. Lay waste to everything from the old world, symbolically destroying the past. It makes his opposition with Rey, the herald of the new Jedi and the future, very poignant.
So, yeah, just to add upon that, and Felix, I wanted to add upon something you had talked about as well. Hux not having the physical strength nor the military to overthrow Kylo Ren. And in a recent interview, Ryan hinted that JJ may come back with the Knights of Ren. So, as we know from The Last Jedi, the Knights of Ren are Force sensitive, and given that they were Luke's former students. On the surface, it would seem indeed that they would follow Ben again since they did before, whether he's a disciple of Snoke or whether he's Supreme Leader of the Galaxy. However, there's new speculation that they could have been, in fact, plants put there by Snoke in Luke's Jedi Temple. So if this is true, they may not have the loyalty to Ben that we would think. And if Hux were able to get to the Knights of Ren, if they was able to get them on his side, that could be game-changing. So I know that some of you also talked about the Force Bond, which is an enormous liability for both Rey and Ben. So if either of the Resistance or the First Order were to discover it, you can guess there's going to be a lot of upheaval. When these Force Bond situations occur, each are talking out loud, and it's not out of the question they'd use each other's names. So given the fact that they have no control when or where they happen, if someone's listening, well, busted. And if it's discovered by both parties near or at the same time, I can easily picture a scenario where Rey and Ben are now joined as allies once again in kind of an us versus the rest of the galaxy kind of situation, which personally, as a lover, a huge Reylo fan, I love that.
Yes. I think one thing everybody's waiting for in 9 is to seeing what happens when the Resistance and First Order find out about the Force Bond, because there's no way that that isn't going to happen in 9. So, moving on to question number 3, let's talk character development. Assuming that we're ultimately getting a Ben Solo redemption in Episode 9, which I think all of us here are expecting, how do you see either Renperor or Benperor setting up that redemption? Team Renperor, what are your thoughts? Tina?
Redemption stories usually, without fail, never include the villain or the anti-hero getting their ultimate goal stated at the beginning of the story as an endgame. They never end up with what they initially wanted. So, in The Force Awakens, Kylo Ren is shown telling his grandfather's melted mask that he will finish what he started. I believe he's referring to ruling the galaxy, which is also stated in both visual dictionaries for TFA and TLJ. Given that this is what's shown as his ultimate desire in the beginning for a while, TFA clearly paints him as a villain, even if a complicated one, ultimately this is not going to be what he ends up with. It's also clear Rey rejected his offer to rule by his side. So, The Last Jedi clearly shows his feelings for her, along with the ultimate heartbreak and subsequent meltdown after she leaves. He may end up leaving by choice or by force, but one thing is clear, he's going to choose the one thing that will truly make him happy in the end, which I believe would be Rey herself. I also see some great unselfish sacrifice coming into play, which he may even offer up his own life in exchange for hers, or to save her, or it's just an unselfish act in general. Unlike Vader, though, I'm sure he'll live through it, even if he himself doesn't expect to. So at that moment, I'm hoping for the kiss of life.
We all are.
Yeah, we all are.
Willow, what do you think?
Tina's point about anti-villains never being happy with the thing they believe they wanted is a fantastic point structurally for the Renperor side of things. It's very important that Kylo managed to come out on top, only to be smacked down immediately by how much he messed up. He is in a dangerous position opposing the woman he loves, and in my opinion, there would be something wholly unsatisfying in Kylo making so many horrible sacrifices and performing such unforgivable crimes if the end goal here is for him to grow up into a great, supportive, confident leader. I think Kylo really needs to learn from his failure by accepting that everything he believed was right was actually completely wrong. I also see Star Wars as a generational coming-of-age story. Coming-of-age stories detail the journeys of young protagonists as they struggle against some outward or inward opposition that is preventing them from growing up. In Ben Solo's case, that opposition presents itself in the form of Kylo. In many ways, Kylo is his own worst enemy and developmental obstacle, and right now he's completely lying to himself. He believes destroying everything is the solution, and I feel entering 9 with that philosophy intact sets Kylo up for a powerful arc resolution. I would take great issue with Kylo developing or casting aside his objectives off-screen, because I feel as though we, the audience, needs to experience that development or transformation with him. We need to see the good and the ugly and journey alongside him. We need to see that selfish love morph into something pure and selfless. We need to see Kylo willing to give up everything and anything, because that is the heart of his redemption, if you ask me. Not the story of a spark of humanity in a machine, but the tale of a boy becoming a man by casting aside his former beliefs and doing what he never thought he could do by embracing the future.
Really good point. Team Benperor, what do you think? Felix?
Well, for me, Benperor sets up a satisfying redemption arc because it legitimately puts Ben in the position of having everything he thought he wanted. Him turning a new leaf loses its impact for me if he's forced to come crawling back to Rey because he's a terrible Renperor who everyone and their pet Porg wants gone. So he needs to have something to lose. And I just don't see Supreme Leadership as genuinely satisfying for him at the end of The Last Jedi. The guy stopped his entire military operation to have a spaghetti western pissing match with his uncle because his Skype girlfriend broke up with him. So he's already kind of proven to me that he can be pretty terrible at Supreme Leadership. He's already at the bottom of the hole he's dug himself into. But if he were to actually make an effort at being good at being Supreme Leader, it raises the stakes for him and for me, for him to have to give all that up. So imagine a Supreme Leader Kylo Ren, who doesn't just have control of the galaxy through an iron rule, but because the citizens of the galaxy are actually satisfied with him as their leader. He has mass public acceptance, something Ben hasn't even really had on a one-to-one basis before. He's successful, popular, wealthy, the most powerful man in the galaxy. He's improved the quality of living galaxy-wide, stuff like that. Something he can be genuinely proud of. And yet, at the end of the day, as he's stripping down to his high-waisted pajama pants and slipping between the sheets, he notices just how big and empty his Emperor-sized bed is. And he realizes everything is still meaningless without the girl.
So you think he'll upgrade from that twin bed?
I hope so. That's bad. Rey deserves a bigger bed anyway.
She does. Considering she's never had a bed.
What do you think?
Okay, so I talked before how he might see that ruling and making big decision isn't as easy as it seems, and kind of be reminded of all those times Leia would complain about the inactivity of the New Republic, and it's really all part of the coming of age story. You become adult only when you realize how hard it is to be an adult, and you really start appreciating everything grown-ups do around you for it. Because in our world, it's the electricity bills, the groceries, the laundry. And for Ben, it would be understanding that even if during all those years he felt abandoned and alone, he can start seeing his mother's perspective. And of course, Leia definitely has her feelings as a mother. I'll be the first person to point them out. And some of the choices she made weren't the right ones, but he'll also start seeing how, she didn't always have it easy either. And I think it's really a shame Carrie Fisher isn't with us anymore, because I remember seeing the movie Hook with Robin Williams a while ago with family I know. In case some of you didn't know, Carrie was a script doctor for that movie. Spoiler alert. Basically, Robin Williams' character's arc is remembering about his time years ago as Peter Pan and learning again how important it is to keep a child's heart, while realizing how much he has neglected his children and, more importantly, his son. However, there was also a moment during the climax of the movie where Peter Pan's son realizes that he too has been acting wrong, and he actually says, "I'm sorry" to his dad. So the mom of the family I was watching the movie with said, it's not often we see children apologizing to their parents in movies, and she's absolutely right. And, for me, that becomes especially poignant when you know about Carrie's personal life and her own relationship with her mother. And, basically, if you look at the original trilogy, it's very much a story about her father and how he has wronged his children and, how he kind of makes up for it. Of course, the original trilogy is very much a result of the revolution in families in the 60s and 70s. But I think the sequel trilogy is meant to present a much more balanced example of a messed up child-parent dynamic and how, both sides are wrong, each in their own way. So I think we're definitely going to get those themes in 9 to an extent, but as I said, Carrie passing away is really a huge loss. But I'm just going to say this as a side note. Considering that perspective, I'm thanking the heavens Trevorrow isn't in charge anymore, considering his previous stances on moms. Just looking at his moves, so yeah.
Yeah, I suspect we're all very relieved that JJ's back for 9.
Yeah. I'm just going to say Psychanalyst would have a blast with that guy.
Question number 4, one wild card that I'm kind of surprised we don't see a lot of talk about in online Star Wars communities is the absence of Snoke in Episode 9. A lot of talk about Snoke getting killed in The Last Jedi, but not a whole lot of speculation on what impact that's going to have going forward. So possibly for the first time in his life, Ben will not have a dark voice whispering inside his head, manipulating him. Do we think that the lack of Snoke will have much impact on Kylo Ren or Ben Solo's ruling style? Team Benperor, how do you see the lack of Snoke as an influence on Supreme Leader Kylo Ren? Irina?
Okay, so there's a reason why they decided to kill off Snoke as early as in the Dark Middle chapter, especially with him being promoted as the big bad. So he is Ben's big bad, and it is a huge step in his character development for him to have broken out of his influence. And, in regards to her redemption arc, it can only be good. Far from complete, of course, and Rey may have the impression that she has failed in her rescue band mission, but she already played a huge role. She hasn't realized that yet, though. I think Ben has an inferiority complex in the sense that he believes that he is nothing, hence one of the reasons why he tells Rey that she's nothing, because he's projecting his feelings on her. And I think one of the ways Snoke would abuse him emotionally is by a constant back and forth between you are important, special, powerful because you're Vader's heir, and you're useless and incompetent. So he did it obviously to manipulate Ben more easily, because people with inferiority complexes crave that fix. So failures hit them harder than would with other people. And obviously that destroyed whatever self-esteem Ben might have had, because Snoke would put emphasis on how he's powerful because of his lineage, and how his failures stem only from himself, because without his lineage, he's nothing. And I think that's where his burned, passed down mentality comes from, because he wants to be valued for himself as an individual. So obviously Snoke is gone now, because Ben has realized how much of a toxic influence he really was on him, by, how he was reacting toward how Snoke was acting towards Rey and everything. So obviously his inferiority complex isn't going to vanish, and he's still going to need his source of validation. So I think that's what's going to push him forward and have him become Benperor, in order to still get Rey's approval, in a sense, which is extremely prejudiced, just saying. One thing he needs to learn is that, he can't always rely on other people for his self-esteem, but that's probably a process that's going to start in 9, but it's really going to take years, and it will go beyond episode 9.
Yes, absolutely. Felix, what do you think?
Well, first, I think alone time is integral for Ben's development in general. Time that's truly alone, without a malevolent figure tainting his thoughts and emotions. In The Last Jedi, killing his mentor and false father created an emotional vacuum that drove Ben to employ similar tactics that Snoke has used with him to try and get Rey to stay with him. And that blew up in his face, literally. This is a character who's been textually, mentally abused by Snoke his entire life, and if you want to read into the subtext, sexually abused. So I think it's integral to his character development on the whole that Ben learned to stand on his own 2 feet. With respect to his rulership, I would expect at first we'd see more rudderless Ben, but once he resolved to be a good ruler, without Snoke's influence, when we'd see Ben put into practice policies that Ben Solo would actually like to see enacted. So his goal before The Last Jedi was destroying The Last Jedi, who was Luke, but is now Rey. And given the please don't make me sleep on the couch look he gives her, I don't necessarily buy his petulant declaration to Luke that he'll destroy her and all the rest. I don't see that as a legitimate goal for him anymore. So without directive from Snoke, what exactly is his goal now? What is it that's going to be driving him in 9? Without Snoke around, and with Luke having become one with the Force, he'll have the freedom to explore who Ben Solo really is, and what Ben Solo's goals really are.
I definitely want to find out what Ben Solo's goals really are. Team Renperor, what do you think? How is the lack of Snoke in Episode 9 going to influence Kylo Ren and the ruling style of the Renperor?
The thing that is so interesting about offing Snoke in the middle chapter is it completely alters the villain structure as we, an audience, have grown accustomed to. In the past, you always had your foot soldier, Vader, Maul, Dooku, whatever, doing most of the physical fighting, with the Emperor looming in the background. Snoke and Luke's deaths, however, force Rey and Kylo to stand on their own 2 feet going into the final chapter. The first thing Kylo tries to do, however, is lean on Rey while encouraging her to do the same thing. He is without a crutch, but rather than stand freely, he attempts to drag someone else down with him. He spills his heart to her in the worst way possible, but she can't answer his call, and after clashing over the lightsaber, she flees with the resistance. I think that Kylo will probably feel very lost and alone without Snoke, more so than ever, because with no real guiding figure. Perhaps Luke will haunt him and make matters worse. Either way, time to contemplate his place in the galaxy can't simply lead to him deciding to be a better ruler, because ultimately, I don't believe there can ever be peace in tyranny. I say tyranny because the First Order is still the First Order, and Star Wars has never been all that deep in many respects. Kylo is definitely a character with a lot of emotional depth, but nothing in the films has painted the First Order as anything more than evil and oppressive. At the end of the day, we need our good guys and our bad guys to battle it out in some way, and while I'm sure Hux is going to stage a coup, potentially with the aid of the Knights of Ren, Kylo and Rey are still the hero and villain of the trilogy. Their rivalry and connection is what drives the story, and their final moment of unity, of balance, would be most satisfying as the overarching narrative's final climax. The last look Rey and Kylo share tells you all you need to know, and the dramatic setup here is nothing short of delicious. We have two opposing factions with our opposing Force leaders. Add that up when you take into account their Force bond of romantic feelings. Their relationship in 9 could serve as the ultimate metaphor for the ending of the war, with both sides engaging in a futile fight and Rey and Kylo feeling obliged by circumstances to do what they feel they have to do. When we look back at this story, I want to be able to reflect on Rey's role as the hero. She is the main character here, the central figure whose narrative is being told. Kylo certainly holds all the weight of the Skywalker legacy on his shoulders, but at the end of the day, I do want Rey's philosophies win out over his. Thinking back in 10 years, I want to remember the sequel trilogy as the legend of the nobody who became the first of the new Jedi, and whose heart freed the last descendant of Anakin Skywalker.
Yeah, just adding to that. So Ben Solo is essentially without a rudder now, so that should be interesting. Without Snoke in his head or knowing his every move, along with Ben having to take the time and energy to either counter it or work with it, I think the effect can only be positive. He's only known that manipulation for the majority of his life, and that's how he knows how to interact with people. I also think that's very much the reason why he botched his proposal with Rey. I'm certain that Snoke has used the same tactics on him, telling him in different words that he's nothing, but not to him, which, by the way, that subtext is all kinds of gross, which we could go on, probably a whole podcast on that. And since that worked with him and getting him to side with Snoke in the First Order, he thinks that'll work with Rey as well. Now that Snoke's voice in his head is gone, the only person in his life that he still has an emotional connection with, whether either of them like it or not, is Rey. The Force bond is very much present, and above all, they cannot control when it happens. Sure, Rey shut the door, but that's only a metaphorical symbol. She isn't happy with him, of course, and he is sleeping on the couch, but there's nothing she can do to sever that connection permanently. So eventually, they'll have to strike up a conversation again, and this is where she can finally begin to have a positive influence on him.
I think that sounds great.
Question number 5. In the addition to the loss of Snoke, another possible source of character motivation for Kylo in Episode 9 would be Rey's rejection. Now, some people take romantic rejection as a motivator to improve themselves, essentially to say F you to their ex and start doing things like working out, maybe they get a new, better job, maybe they start dating a new, quote-unquote, hotter partner. Conversely, rejection sends other people into a deep depression where they don't even want to leave the house. And in Kylo's case, we might be looking at a third possibility, which would be the rejection sending someone into a rage. These are the exes who stalk you on Facebook, try to sabotage your new relationship, and let the air out of the tires of your car. I don't know how likely that'll be, but it's a possibility. Team Renperor, how do you see Kylo dealing with Rey's rejection, and will it impact him as a ruler? Willow?
Well, once again, I tend to see fixation on past wrongs and hurt as Kylo's most vital character trait and obstacle going forward in Episode 9. While Rey will surely attempt to build something new, Kylo will continue to contrast her ideals by wallowing in his own personal misery. He will trap himself, so to speak, and this is what he'll have to overcome in order to complete his coming-of-age journey. Rian Johnson, Adam Driver, and Kathleen Kennedy have all talked in depth about Kylo as a metaphor for the worst parts of adolescence, namely rebellion against the parental hierarchy and their associated political circles, in this case, the Jedi Order and the rebellion. I tend to side somewhere between the third and fourth breakup reactions for Kylo, but I do expect him to do anything. Depending entirely on what kind of conclusion J.J. Abrams decides to go for, it could be very important structurally that Kylo and Rey remain antagonists throughout much of 9. Together, they are the balance. True star-crossed lovers. In that vein, everything is setting us up for a grand duel of personal and political ideologies. And while I believe Kylo's motivations and goals are very relatable and understandable even in his speech to Rey in The Last Jedi, at the end of the day, he is wrong and always has been. He could realize this sooner than expected at 9 and perhaps pull kind of a Zuko, as in wander back with a white flag raised, but that would also do away with both the potential for Renperor and Benperor.
Tina, what do you think?
So again, I think this can only have a positive influence. even if Ben won't admit it at the moment, especially in this very hollow, I'll destroy her, this clearly isn't the case. His romantic feelings are very much there, and he won't be going away anytime soon. He may start off as either angry or depressed, but I don't see this lasting, especially with the presence of the Force bond. This is going to be his biggest motivator in changing him to become a better person. In most romantic stories, whether it be drama or comedy or something darker, doesn't matter what the genre, one party always does something either at the halfway point or at the 2/3 of the way in, like in this case. It's just like what we like to call Ben's Darth Darcy moment, where one party completely drops the ball and the other isn't pleased. And in this case, I'd say Rey isn't pleased, to say the least. But even though Rey and Ben's situation may be a more extreme case of this, it still follows the same trope/plot trajectory. And in the end, the one in the wrong always ends up making the better choice for the sake of their love for the other in the end. So I stated my thoughts earlier on Rey coming to Ben's rescue in the event he finds himself in the middle of a coup, and the only way he's going to do that is if he's begun making those changes within himself.
Absolutely. Team Benperor, what do you think will be the impact of Rey's rejection on Kylo's ruling style? Irina?
Okay, so I don't think Ben is going to want Rey dead, or that he's even going to be angry at her, because when he kneels down on the ground for Rey, who's in a falcon, I think it's a very clear indicator of that. I do think that there's a breach of trust, though, because in the last scene, you can clearly see how much he loathes himself. And if you take a look at how Rey and Ben's confrontation went down, my theory is that Ben has come to the conclusion that Rey has been sent by Luke or the Resistance to bring him back and to kill him if he refuses. Because, well, let's face it, he has every reason to suspect that, especially after what happened with Luke. So, however, while he was conscious, Rey didn't kill him and just left. When they'll see each other again, I think Ben is going to be in a miserable state, and that's why Rey reaches out to him, because she feels his pain. So it could be because Leia passed away or something like that. I think he's going to confront her, not so much because he's angry, but something more along the lines of, why didn't you get me out of this misery while you still had the chance? And of course, he's wrong about Rey's intentions. She came with the intention of him coming back with her, but she wasn't sent by a third party. She really did it for him, and it to be a wake-up call for them both. If he goes for a more, let's say, humanitarian, let's get shit done approach, I think he'll definitely have Rey's past in mind in every altruistic action he'll impose. In the interrogation scene, his voice really gets all wobbly when he sees Rey's past, so I think that not only he was relating to Rey's loneliness, but he also saw how hard and miserable her life on Jakku was. Like, seriously, every time Rey is sad or talks about how sad and lost she is, he looks like he's gonna tear up every time. Another layer you can add to the "you're nothing but not to me" speech is that he knows how mistreated and even belittled Rey has been her entire life, and he admires her not so much he doesn't understand why anyone could treat her that way. For me, it would be a perfect way of showcasing how Rey brings out the best in Ben as a catalyst, and not in a Rey drags Ben's arse back to life manner.
Felix, what do you think?
Personally, I think that 9 will open with a self-loathing, depressed Kylo Ren eating blue ice cream in his pajamas, with Hux trying to hook him up with new tail because, killing depressed Kylo somehow just isn't as enjoyable for him. But no, seriously, depressed, melancholic, angsty Kylo is kind of what I see in the beginning. The door slam and the disappearing dice were for Ben's benefit. So although we as the audience should understand on a symbolic level a door implies it can be opened again, and that the dice still actually do exist, it's important for Ben to think that the door is closed forever, and that the chance at being a pair is gone for good. And I think a natural response to that would be a depressed stage where he's pretty hands-off as a leader. I can also see Ben having a stage after that where he tries to convince Rey and himself during a force time scene that he's perfectly happy being the supreme leader and he's doing just fine without her, thank you very much. And of course, I think she'd do the same. I think she's going to throw herself fully into learning how to be a Jedi. I tend to see their individual journeys as parallel, so he'll throw himself fully into being supreme leader. I think Rey's rejection could end up being used by the writers as a driving point for Ren proving himself as a leader.
Kind of the equivalent of Darcy getting Lydia out of the mess that she's in with saving face for the Bennett family.
Yes, exactly.
Moving on to our final individual question here. The sequel trilogy has so far seen a lot of thematic hints at balance and references to fairy tales. How do you see these playing into whether we get a Renperor or a Benperor in episode 9? Team Renperor, how do you think a Benperor will tie in with the themes and fairy tale motifs of the sequel trilogy? Felix?
Well, thematically, Benperor creates a setup for the balance that we got to see briefly when the pair touched hands. The Force itself says on some level that they were both wrong in the throne room, because the saber splits in half rather than choosing a side like it did when it called to Rey in The Force Awakens. So to me, this implies Ben is right in some manner. Since we know Rey is in the right because she's on the light side, and she understands moving away from the past is about saving what she loves, the question I have to ask myself is, in what way was Ben right, if not in rulership of the galaxy? Ben might be wrong in his methods, but it remains to be seen what changes he wants to make in the galaxy. They might actually align more with something Rey would want to see than she realizes. For instance, better living conditions for people like her and Rose. And usurping the throne puts him in a unique position to right all of the wrongs of the galaxy as he sees fit. I'm open to Renperor, but I have a hard time seeing how Renperor answers the question that I feel was asked of me as an audience member to consider when the sabers split, which is, in what way is Ben Solo right? Also, the Supreme Leader and the Scavenger as a romantic coupling stays in alignment with the Prince and the Pauper and royalty and commoner motifs we also see in the prequel trilogy and original trilogy romances, with the Queen and the Slave and the Princess and the Scoundrel. And I have a hard time picturing Rey being fully romantically involved with Renperor. I have an easier time seeing Rey becoming fully romantically involved with a man who is right in what he wants to accomplish, especially if that contrasts with what she might come to see in the Resistance, which could be people like Poe playing hero just for the sake of heroics, at the expense of his own people's lives.
Yes, we've all seen what happens with Poe's ego. Irina, what do you think?
Okay, so like Felix, I think Renperor is definitely a possibility, and I've actually prepared myself mentally to see it happen. And on the other hand, I think it could definitely be interesting if Rey and Ben set a meeting somewhere to discuss something, maybe taking down First Order or at least the back parts of it, and do it from the inside. And, Rey could have a bit of a Lizzie at Pemberley moment, and in those scenes, she'd see that, even if Ben is a big, beautiful mess, he did try. He did what he did not only to avoid having, someone like Hux taking over the First Order, but also because at the bottom line, he has good intentions and he genuinely wants to help people, even if his methods aren't exactly the best. Because, well, let's face it, we've seen in extra material that some planets were more scarred than others by all the damage the Empire has done. And Bloodline even made a point of showing that the planets who were the most likely to side with the First Order against the New Republic were planets who were the most neglected, because the New Republic was bogged down by what I'm going to call bureaucratic fights, just like the Old Republic was. Star Wars is a bit of an exceptional case, because if you look at fairy tales, it ends with benevolent rulers taking over, the land is happy, and so on and so forth. Even modern fairy tales like Narnia are all about the good kings and queens. And one thing I find very interesting is that the good rulers taking over are most of the time nobody. So again, with Narnia, the first king and queen, Frank and Helen, were nobodies. The Pevensey children, well, they had a prophecy behind them, but they were nobody. You also got Prince Caspian, who very interestingly becomes the good king of his era, and he's a descendant of invaders. So Star Wars under George Lucas had a very positive outlook on democracy, which is different from other fairy tales, and that is something that was emphasized by Padme. Even though, well, let's face it, Padme probably had a pretty idealistic outlook on democracy herself. So, however, I can't say monarchy has necessarily been always presented as a bad thing, because, Padme was a queen, but, it doesn't really count since she was elected, but we did have Alderaan. And, of course, Alderaan had a queen, Rhaeha Organa, probably not pronouncing her name right. She had some power. And I'm not sure whether Alderaan was a constitutional monarchy or just a monarchy, but it was definitely represented as an ideal society. And you could refer to it as, Sir Thomas More's Utopia in space. So what the prequel trilogy and the original trilogy were condemning, however, were dictatorships and totalitarian regimes. So Palpatine was emperor, but you could seriously say it's a fancy word for dictator. Where I'm coming at is, my ideal ending for the sequel trilogy would be Rey and Ben ruling together, but, in a constitutional monarchy kind of regime, with the intention of, doing the heavy lifting and making sure the galaxy is stable and prospering. Stormtroopers kind of becoming the equivalent of blue helmets, which, that's what Jedi were supposed to do until the dark side fogged their sight, which is a fancy way of saying that they're heads are up their arses. The planet is in a stable enough state, it becomes independent and rules itself. I don't think Lucasfilm will be gutsy enough to go that way, even though last time we said Lucasfilm would be gutsy enough to do something, they actually did it. Even though we got clear proof that the New Republic, as a copy-paste of the Old Republic, clearly didn't work, I'm kind of skeptical on whether we'll get a New Republic 2.0. But, again, for me, best solution would be planets administrating themselves, because small governments for the win. But there's a lot of work to be done, and some planets won't be able to rebuild themselves without a little push. I think that ultimately it would be a message showing that being in a position of power is not a privilege. It's really a case where you have a duty towards your people and rules and responsibilities.
Absolutely. It'd be nice if some people in our government could learn that. Team Renperor, how do you see Renperor's role thematically?
So I would say, given Ben's meltdown on Crate in front of every one of his own men who saw it happen, I just don't see how his role can last. In his first move as Supreme Leader, he failed miserably. Sure, he's force sensitive, and as an individual, he's someone to be reckoned with, but he's one person against an army of many. And there's also the very likely chance that cameras were set up in Snoke's throne room. I'd actually be surprised if there weren't. So it's going to come out that he was not only the one who killed Snoke, but defeated the guards with Rey's help. I very much doubt we'll be getting a time jump for this very reason. And add to that the possibility of someone on the Resistance side of things discovering the Force bond with Rey, and now we've got the makings for a true upheaval of where things left off in The Last Jedi. So thematically, I see a very action-packed adventure where everyone is once again, everything is taken off the table and the board game is flipped over and pieces go flying in every direction. So if we thought TLJ was a series of twists and turns, especially with seemingly romantic Reylo getting turned on its ear into jilted Renperor, this is going to be multiplied times 10.
Yes. Willow, what are your thoughts?
Well, Kylo and Rey seem to be representing two lifestyles, and I believe that is going to be brought to full fruition in Episode 9. While Kylo is all about laying waste to the past, Rey is about embracing the future. But the truth is, you need both. You can't just burn the past or forget about it. You have to learn from it. You have to let it guide you without allowing it to rule you. That's as relevant to anything where the Jedi are concerned. They fell from grace as a result of their own shortcomings, their own failures. Luke simply repeated those same errors with Ben and his generation of Jedi. But Rey and Kylo have the opportunity to grow beyond that. Kylo, the man who carries the burden and sins of the past, and Rey, the woman who carries all the new blood, an open heart who can never be bogged down by what has come before. I'm also a big supporter of Rey and Kylo as an inverse retelling of Anakin and Padme's love story in the prequel trilogy. I'm bringing this up because while I'm not a fan of Benperor, as in Kylo as a benevolent emperor, I have warmed up to the idea of Ben becoming involved in politics when he inevitably plays some part in rebuilding the Republic, which I do think is going to happen. Not as a solo leader, there's a pun there. And Star Wars is like poetry, right? The Last Jedi really hammered home the idea of Rey and Kylo as inverse Anakin and Padme. From the firelight talk parallels to Rey in her coffin, to Kylo and Rey's dialogue in the throne room. In the prequels, we had Anakin fall to the dark side as a result of an inability to let go of his fear and loss and his selfish love for Padme. In the sequels, we're experiencing Ben Solo's rebirth from the dark side through selfless love. If you think about it, in becoming Benperor, Kylo has kind of become the kind of ruler Anakin spoke about to Padme in the prequels. That's all Renperor can ever be, if you ask me. As I said earlier, there can never be peace under tyranny, in my opinion. But I do think it would be really powerful if Rey went on to rebuild the Jedi Order and Ben played a hand in the reconstruction of the Republic. Together, they could represent the two societal spheres that tore apart the Republic to begin with, Republic, politics, and religion. But this time, they would work together.
Absolutely. Had quite a debate here today, and we're almost out of time. Let's have each team summarize their thoughts on the subject. Team Renperor, what are your closing arguments on the Renperor versus Benperor debate?
Well, I'll say regardless of however this plays out, whether we get a version of Renperor, Benperor, or a little mix of both, I'm open to however this plays out as long as we get a living, breathing Ben Solo when all is said and done. I'm still a fan of the scenario laid out, which ends with Ben and Rey together on the run halfway through the film, working together from the sidelines for a solution. We've all seen what they can achieve together when they work together, and it's pretty impressive. Plus, I don't think anything gets more romantic than an us against the galaxy scenario. Still, I'm in this for redemption and endgame Reylo period, so as long as we get that, no matter how it plays out, I'm happy as a clam.
Willow, what do you think?
Ultimately, like Tina, I'm more than open to any story direction that revolves around a redeemed Ben Solo. I can only look at what the story is telling me, and while I certainly think there is some potential for a 9 featuring Benperor, I'm unconvinced that Star Wars would truly be willing to explore Kylo as a benevolent or good emperor simply because the notion seems to contradict the whole idea of positive democracy that the franchise has promoted. Lost Renperor, who has to realize the errors of his ways and the faults of tyrannical leadership and meet the Last Jedi halfway through selfless love is a far more powerful emotional storyline in my eyes. So in a way, you could say that I'm anticipating Renperor, but Renperor who evolves into something else as a result of his own failures, both in losing Rey and whatever else he fucks up going forward.
Team Benperor, what are your closing arguments? Felix?
Well, to summarize my major points, Benperor satisfies the theme of finding balance because it justifies the saber not simply going to Rey. It also makes the traditional fairy tale motif of royalty plus commoner viable. A benevolent supreme leader raises the stakes for Ben to have to give up anything to be Rey because he'll actually have something of value to give up. The place the Last Jedi left Ben was in the bottom of the pit of despair. So, after some wallowing, he has nowhere to go but up. Finally, Ben needs to mature on his own, away from Rey, just as she needs to mature away from him before they can have a successful romance. We assume Rey will mature on her own, but if Ben is simply the Renperor nobody wants, how does this mature him as a character? Choosing to be the best leader that is within possibility for him would force Ben Solo to grow up, and that's ultimately the direction I see for his character. To that end, I too can see Renperor or Benperor being a feasible route that J.J. Abrams takes. But personally speaking, Benperor satisfies the questions and fills the gaps the Last Jedi raised for me. Like Tina, though, ultimately I am invested in Han and Leia's son redeeming himself and he and Rey getting to find the belonging they deserve in each other.
Well said. Irina, what are your closing thoughts?
Well, my closing thoughts would be pretty much everything Felix said. I'm not going to say much. I will say that one thing that's very important for me is, of course, a happy ending for Ben, for everyone involved. But I think it's also very important for me that not only Rey has to mature as a character, evolve from a bit of a black and white thinking to something that's more Rey's, having a better outlook on the world, but also for me, it's very important for Ben to kind of discover what agency really is. And simply because Ben never really had any agency in his life. So I really want to be able to make his own decisions. And, you know, the narrative, when he makes the good decisions, the narrative doesn't punish him for it. And for me, that's probably one of the most important things I want to see in episode 9.
I agree. It sounds great. Well, that about wraps up this episode of Star Wars Connection, the Benperor versus Renperor edition. I'd like to thank all of our listeners for joining us, and I'd like to thank our guests, Irina, Willow, Tina, and Felix. Thank you all. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. This concludes Star Wars Connection podcast of Renperor vs. Benperor. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can leave questions for us in our comment section, or you can email us at starwarsconnection09@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Mixcloud. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.